At 11:30 on the morning of December 22nd, 1944, Private First Class Leo Palmer crouched in his frozen foxhole south of Bastogne, Belgium, watching 4 German soldiers approach through the snow carrying white flags. The temperature was -20 degrees Celsius. His hands were so numb he could barely grip his Browning automatic rifle. Ice crystals formed in his nostrils with each breath. He had been in this position for 48 hours, without hot food, without adequate winter clothing, without hope of reinforcement. The German officers walking toward him wore long wool overcoats and shiny black boots. They looked warm, well-fed, confident. Palmer knew what they wanted. They wanted the Americans to surrender. The senior German officer was Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps. The junior officer, Lieutenant Helmuth Henke of the Panzer Lehr Operations Section, carried a briefcase under his arm. Inside that briefcase was an ultimatum that promised total annihilation if the Americans refused to surrender within 2 hours. The Germans had every reason to expect success. They had the 101st Airborne Division completely surrounded. 5 German divisions against 1 American division. The Americans were outnumbered 5-1. They had no tanks worth mentioning. They were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, food. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft for 6 days. No air support, no supply drops, no hope of immediate relief. What the Germans did not know was that the American commander in Bastogne was a 46-year-old artillery officer named Anthony McAuliffe, who had never heard of the word surrender. And in the next 17 minutes, McAuliffe would give a one-word reply that would echo through military history, inspire a surrounded division to fight on, confuse and demoralize the German command, and help turn the tide of Hitler's last desperate offensive in Western Europe, the Battle of Dole. The Bulge had started 6 days earlier on December 16th when 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks smashed through the American lines in the Ardennes forest. It was Hitler's final gamble, a massive surprise offensive designed to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, pulled veteran divisions from the Eastern Front, collected every operational tank and assault gun he could find. Boys of 16 and men of 50 were pressed into service. This was Germany's last chance to avoid total defeat. The German build-up had been masterful. Units moved only at night under radio silence. Horses pulled artillery to avoid engine noise. The Wehrmacht concentrated 3 armies in the Ardennes, opposite the weakest part of the American line. They achieved what military professionals call operational surprise. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had failed to detect the German buildup. Ultra-intercepts had dried up because the Germans were maintaining radio silence. Aerial reconnaissance was hampered by bad weather. Ground patrols reported increased activity but were dismissed as nervous imagination. The frontline units in the Ardennes were either inexperienced divisions getting their first taste of combat or exhausted divisions sent there to rest. The 106th Infantry Division had been in the line for 5 days. The 28th Infantry Division was recuperating from the Hurtgen Forest bloodbath. They were not prepared for what hit them. The German plan required speed. They had to capture key road junctions before the Allies could react, before the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to dominate the battlefield. Bastogne was one of those key road junctions. 7 major roads converged on this small Belgian market town. Control Bastogne, control movement through the southern Ardennes. Without Bastogne, the German offensive would bog down. With Bastogne, they could drive to Antwerp. General Dwight Eisenhower recognized the danger immediately. On December 17th, he ordered the 101st Airborne Division to move from their rest area at Mourmelon-le-Grand near Reims, France, to Bastogne. The division had been recovering from 3 months of combat in Holland during Operation Market Garden. They had taken heavy casualties. Many of the men were on leave in Paris. The division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington attending a staff conference. The assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. That left Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, in temporary command. McAuliffe was not supposed to be commanding an airborne division in the biggest battle of the Western Front. He was an artilleryman, a 1918 West Point graduate who had spent most of his career around howitzers and fire direction centers, born in Washington, D.C. On July 2, 1898, McAuliffe had attended West Virginia University before entering West Point in 1917. His class underwent an accelerated program due to World War I, graduating in November 1918 just as that war ended. For 25 years, McAuliffe had served in various artillery positions, a competent but unremarkable officer slowly climbing the ranks. World War II changed everything. He had jumped into Normandy with the 101st on D-Day, breaking his back during a practice jump in May but still going into combat on June 6th. When Brigadier General Don Pratt was killed during the glider landings, McAuliffe was promoted to Assistant Division Commander. He had proven himself under fire in Normandy and again in Holland during Operation Market Garden, and now, through circumstances beyond anyone's control, the defence of Bastogne and perhaps the outcome of the entire German offensive rested on his shoulders. The 100 first started arriving in Bastogne late on December 18th, after a brutal 107-mile truck ride through freezing rain and snow. The journey itself was a nightmare. Men packed into open trucks, no room to sit, standing for hours in the freezing darkness. Some trucks broke down and had to be abandoned. Others skidded off icy roads. Men jumped from moving vehicles to relieve themselves, then ran to catch up. They passed retreating American units heading the opposite direction, defeated troops warning them to turn back, that the Germans had Tigers, Panthers, entire divisions. The paratroopers ignored them and pressed on. They came without proper winter clothing. The division had been resting, refitting, expecting to spend Christmas in camp. Many men lacked overcoats, winter boots, or gloves. They wore summer uniforms with field jackets, jump boots that would freeze solid, thin gloves that offered no protection against frostbite. Some wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. Others stuffed newspapers inside their jackets for insulation. They had been told this would be a short deployment, a few days at most. They would stop the Germans, hand over to relieving units, and return to camp. No one expected to be surrounded. No one expected to be under siege. No one expected what was about to happen. By December 20th, German forces had cut all roads leading into Bastogne. The 101st, along with elements of Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and various other units that had retreated into the town, were completely encircled. About 14,000 American troops trapped in a town that before the war had 8,000 inhabitants. Outside the perimeter, 5 German divisions pressed in: the 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr Division, 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and elements of 2 other divisions. The Germans had tanks, artillery, ammunition, supplies, and time. The Americans had determination. The first major loss that shook the defenders came on December 19th when Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade was killed by German artillery at Neuville. Laprade commanded the 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He had installed his headquarters in a building in Neuville, a small village north of Bastogne. A German 88mm shell crashed through the building. Laprade was killed instantly by the explosion. Major William Desabry, who was with him, was severely wounded, losing an eye. The sudden death of a battalion commander sent shock through the regiment. If a lieutenant colonel could die that quickly, that easily, what chance did privates and corporals have? The second devastating blow came when most of the division medical company was captured. The medics had set up an aid station in what they thought was a secure area. They were treating wounded from the previous day's fighting when German forces suddenly appeared. The Germans had infiltrated through a gap in the American perimeter during the night. Within minutes, the aid station was overrun. Over 100 medical personnel captured, including crucial surgical staff. Dozens of wounded Americans taken prisoner. Medical supplies, ambulances, surgical equipment, all lost. From that point on, the wounded in Bastogne would receive only the most basic medical care. The losses mounted daily. Each death, each capture, each wounded soldier who could not be properly treated added to the desperation. Company commanders who started with 150 men were down to 60 or 70. Platoons that should have 40 men had 15 or 20. Squad leaders commanded 3 or 4 soldiers instead of 12. The defenders knew they were on their own. No relief was coming soon. The weather prevented any air support or supply drops. German artillery pounded the town day and night. The screaming Mimis, Nebelwerfer rockets, came in salvos of 6, their distinctive howl terrifying soldiers and civilians alike. 88mm shells punched through buildings like they were made of paper. 150mm howitzers turned entire blocks into rubble. The medieval buildings offered little protection. Stone walls that had stood for centuries were blown apart by high explosive shells. The Cathedral of St. Peter took multiple direct hits but somehow remained standing. The town square became a moonscape of craters and debris. Civilians huddled in cellars as their homes collapsed above them. Some cellars held 50 or 60 people. Men, women, children, babies, all pressed together in the darkness, listening to the thunder above, wondering if the next shell would bury them alive. The cold was as much an enemy as the Germans. Temperatures dropped to -28 degrees Celsius on the worst nights. Rifle bolts froze, solid. Machine gun mechanisms had to be worked constantly to prevent freezing. Morphine syrettes had to be thawed in medics' mouths before injection. Blood plasma froze before it could be administered. Men urinated on their rifles to thaw the actions. They learned to keep one round chambered at all times because working the bolt might be impossible. Frostbite claimed more casualties than German bullets some days. Men would remove their boots to check their feet and find toes black with gangrene. The medical aid stations filled with soldiers who would lose fingers, toes, entire limbs to the cold. By the morning of December 22nd, the situation in Bastogne was critical. The defenders had been under constant attack for 2 days. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius at night. Wounded men were dying from exposure as much as from their injuries. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the few remaining medics. Men's feet swelled so badly from the cold that they had to cut their boots open to prevent gangrene. The American artillery was running dangerously low on ammunition. Some batteries were down to 10 rounds per gun. Infantry units reported they had enough small arms ammunition for 1 more serious fight, maybe 2 if they were careful. Food supplies were critically low. Most units were on 1/3 rations. Hot food was a memory. Men survived on cold K rations and melted snow. Medical supplies were almost gone. Morphine was rationed. Surgeons operated without anesthetic. Bandages were washed and reused. The wounded lay on church pews and classroom floors because there were no more stretchers. McAuliffe knew all of this. He visited the frontline units every day, driving through artillery barrages in his jeep, walking the perimeter, checking positions, talking to the men. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, the hunger, the cold, the fear. He saw 18-year-old privates with feet so swollen from frostbite they could barely walk. He saw sergeants who had not slept in 4 days still directing their men, still fighting. He saw lieutenants, 22, 23 years old, commanding companies because all the captains were dead or wounded. He saw all of this, and he knew they could not hold much longer without relief. That was the situation when the 4 Germans approached Palmer's position at 11:30 on December 22nd. Palmer did not know what to do. Enemy soldiers approaching under a white flag that was not in the training manual. Staff Sergeant Carl Dickinson, who had been manning a position nearby, took charge. He called the Germans over. Lieutenant Henke, who spoke perfect English, explained they had a written message for the American commander. They would consent to being blindfolded. In fact, they had brought their own blindfolds, white cloth strips that looked like they had been torn from bed sheets. Private First Class Ernest Premetz, a medic who spoke German, joined Dickinson. Together they blindfolded the 2 German officers and led them on a circuitous route through the American positions to the F Company command post. The Germans could not see where they were going, but they could hear. They heard American voices, tired but determined. They heard weapons being cleaned and loaded, They heard sergeants giving orders. They did not hear panic. They did not hear defeat. The message was passed up the chain of command. First Sergeant Konstantin Pappas informed Captain James Adams that the Germans had already presented a written message. Lieutenant William Hertzky was on the phone, reading it to the battalion command post in Marvi. From battalion it went to the 327th Regimental Headquarters. Colonel Joseph Harper, the regimental commander, was out inspecting positions. Major Alvin Jones, the regimental operations officer, took the message and drove to division headquarters. It reached McAuliffe at 11:45. He was in the headquarters basement in the Plomes, Heinz Barracks, a cold, damp stone room that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke. Maps covered the walls, marked with red and blue symbols, showing enemy and friendly positions. Radio operators hunched over their sets, trying to maintain communication with the scattered units. Staff officers worked at wooden tables lit by kerosene lanterns because the electricity had been cut 2 days earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, the acting chief of staff, entered McAuliffe's sleeping quarters and woke him. "The Germans have sent some people forward to take our surrender," Moore said. McAuliffe, still groggy from sleep, sat up and said, "Us surrender? Oh, nuts." Moore handed him the German message. It was typed on 2 sheets, one in English, one in German. The diacritical marks on the German copy had been entered by hand, suggesting it was typed on an English typewriter. The English version read, "To the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. This time the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armoured units. More German armoured units have crossed the river Ourthe near Orthioville, have taken Marche and reached Saint-Hubert by passing through Hompré, Cibré, Tillet. Libremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honourable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The German commander. McAuliffe read the message, crumpled it into a ball, threw it in a wastepaper basket, and muttered again, "Oh, nuts." Then he walked out to visit some units on the western perimeter to congratulate them for eliminating a German roadblock earlier that morning. As far as he was concerned, the German demand did not deserve a response. The Germans were taking one hell of a beating and they wanted the Americans to surrender. It was absurd, but the Germans were waiting for an answer. They had come under a flag of truce with a formal written demand. Military protocol required some kind of response. When McAuliffe returned to the headquarters an hour later, his staff was discussing what to say. Someone suggested a formal military response outlining why surrender was not an option. Someone else suggested explaining the tactical situation, that the 4th Armoured Division was approaching from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, the division operations officer, had a different idea. Inside, in the presence of his staff, McAuliffe wondered aloud, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." At that point, Kinnard said, "What you said initially would be hard to beat." McAuliffe asked, "What do you mean?" Kinnard said, "Sir, you said nuts." All members of the staff enthusiastically agreed. McAuliffe grabbed a piece of paper and wrote, "To the German commander. Nuts, the American commander." He handed it to a clerk and said, "Have it typed up." The typed response was given to Colonel Joseph Harper, commander of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. Harper would deliver it personally to the German officers who were still waiting blindfolded in the woods adjacent to the F Company Foxhole command post. Harper took Private First-Class Premetz with him as an interpreter. When they reached the German officers, Harper handed the message to the blindfolded Major Wagner, putting it in his hand. Henke asked if the reply was written or verbal. Harper said it was written. Henke asked about the contents of the message, because if it was affirmative, they were authorized to negotiate further. Harper said, the reply consists of a single word, nuts. Henke, not understanding, asked, is that reply negative or affirmative? Harper replied, the reply is decidedly not affirmative, adding, if you continue this foolish attack, your losses will be tremendous. Henke translated for Wagner. The major nodded. The two blindfolded German officers were then driven, again by a roundabout route, back to their entry point at the Kessler farm. There, the blindfolds were removed. The Germans opened and looked at the reply. They asked, what does this mean? They obviously did not understand the American slang. Harper and Premetz discussed how to explain it. Harper suggested, tell them to take a flying shit. Premetz thought about it, then straightened up, faced the Germans, and said in German, Du kannst zum Teufel gehen, you can go to hell. The German major's face darkened. Henke translated Harper's additional comment. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city. Henke replied, we will kill many Americans, this is war. Harper responded, we will kill many Germans. Then Harper said, on your way, bud, and good luck to you. After Henke translated, the major acknowledged. They saluted, and the Germans started to walk away. Harper angrily called out, if you don't know what I'm talking about, simply go back to your commanding officer and tell him to just plain go to hell. As the German major passed Palmer's position, he threw down his blindfold. Palmer caught it. He would later use it to clean his Browning automatic rifle and then throw it away, not realizing its historical significance. The German party returned to their lines at 1400 hours, 2 in the afternoon. They drove first to the 901st Panzer Grenadier Regiment headquarters at Luttrebois, then to the Panzer-Lehr Division headquarters about a mile further south. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, happened to be at the Panzer-Lehr headquarters. When Major Wagner and Lieutenant Henke presented the American reply, Luttwitz could not believe it. He had been confident the Americans would surrender. He had already prepared to accept the surrender, to march into Bastogne as a victor. Instead, he received a one-word message he did not understand. General Fritz Bayerlein of the Panzer-Lehr Division said it was time to start the artillery barrage from behind the hill. Luttwitz interrupted him, explaining that the heavy artillery was no longer there. It had been moved to forward positions past Bastogne to support the drive toward the Meuse River. The 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions mentioned in the ultimatum were a fabrication. Luttwitz had been bluffing, trying to intimidate the Americans into surrendering without a fight. When the bluff was called, he had nothing. The promised massive artillery barrage never materialized. Word of McAuliffe's response spread through the American lines within hours. Soldiers who had been on the edge of despair suddenly found new energy. If the general thought the situation was nuts, not desperate, then maybe they could hold out. If the commanding general could tell the Germans to go to hell when surrounded and outnumbered 5-1, then by God they could keep fighting. The story grew with each telling. Some said McAuliffe had torn up the surrender demand. Others said he had used much stronger language than nuts. But everyone understood the message. No surrender, not now, not ever. Vincent Vicari, McAuliffe's personal aide, would later confirm that nuts was exactly what the general said. General Mack was the only general I ever knew who did not use profane language, Vicari recalled. Nuts was part of his normal vocabulary. When asked years later about the famous reply, Vicari said it perfectly captured McAuliffe's personality, direct, unpretentious, and absolutely determined. The effect on German morale was equally significant but opposite. German soldiers had been told the Americans in Bastogne were finished, that surrender was inevitable. The offensive depended on speed, on crushing resistance quickly and moving on. Every day Bastogne held was another day the German timetable slipped, another day for Allied reinforcements to arrive, another day closer to the weather clearing and Allied aircraft returning. When word spread that the Americans had rejected the surrender demand with a single incomprehensible word, German soldiers began to wonder what kind of enemy they were facing. Experienced German tank commanders who had fought across Russia and France knew when an enemy was ready to break. The Americans in Bastogne should have been ready to break. Surrounded, outnumbered, no air support, limited supplies, terrible weather. Every military indicator pointed to surrender. But they had not surrendered. They had responded with a word that even when translated made no tactical sense. This psychological dimension of warfare proved crucial. The side that believes it will win has an enormous advantage over the side that begins to doubt. McAuliffe's nuts created doubt in German minds while strengthening American resolve. That psychological shift was worth more than a regiment of reinforcements. Field Marshal Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, was furious when he learned of the American response. He had counted on Bastogne falling by December 22nd. His panzer divisions were supposed to be across the Meuse River by Christmas. Instead, they were stuck besieging a single town. The weather cleared on December 23rd. For the first time in a week, the sun broke through the clouds. Within hours, C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne, dropping supplies by parachute. Medical supplies, ammunition, food, winter clothing floated down into the American perimeter. 241 planes dropped 144 tons of supplies. Not enough to solve all problems, but enough to keep fighting. More importantly, the clear weather meant Allied fighter bombers could return. P-47s roared over German positions, dropping bombs, firing rockets, strafing anything that moved. On Christmas Eve, McAuliffe issued a message to his troops. He sat in the cold basement headquarters, typing on a battered typewriter by candlelight. Outside, German Luftwaffe bombers were making their nightly run. The building shook with each explosion. Plaster dust drifted from the ceiling. McAuliffe typed steadily, choosing each word carefully. He told them about the German surrender demand and his reply. "What's merry about all this, you ask?" he wrote. "We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home. All true, but what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades, the 10th Armoured Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion and all the rest? Just this. We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us from the north, east, south and west. We have identifications from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were headed straight west for key points when the Eagle Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present, and being privileged to take part in this gallant feat of arms, are truly making for ourselves a Merry Christmas." The message was mimeographed and distributed to every unit. Company commanders read it to their men in foxholes, in basements, in the ruins of buildings. Some soldiers wept, others cheered. All understood that their commanding general was with them, understood their suffering, and believed they would prevail. That same night, German forces launched their heaviest attack yet. The Afrika Korps veterans of the Panzer Lehr Division struck from the west. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attacked from the southeast. The 26th Volksgrenadier pressed from the northeast. Tanks and infantry, supported by artillery, tried to break the American perimeter at multiple points. At Charmes, Team Cherry of the 10th Armoured Division faced 18 German tanks, supported by a regiment of infantry. The Americans had 4 tank destroyers and 2 companies of paratroopers. The German tanks advanced in the darkness, their engines roaring, their tracks clanking on the frozen ground. The tank destroyers waited until the Germans were within 300 yards, then opened fire. The night exploded with muzzle flashes and explosions. German tanks burst into flames, infantry scattered. The attack was repulsed, but at a cost. Team Cherry lost half its strength. Near Marvy, the 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry, faced a battalion of German paratroopers, elite Fallschirmjäger who had jumped into Crete, fought in Italy, knew their business. The Germans attacked just after midnight, moving through the woods like ghosts. They got within grenade range before being detected. The fight was hand-to-hand in places, bayonets and knives in the darkness. Private First Class Thomas Gallagher killed 3 Germans with his entrenching tool when his rifle jammed. The glider infantry held, but barely. The most serious threat came at Flamieres, where German tanks and infantry found a gap in the American lines. They poured through, heading straight for Bastogne. If they broke through, the entire defense would collapse. McAuliffe scraped together his last reserve, a provisional company of cooks, clerks, and walking wounded. They were led by Major William de Sobry, who had been wounded at Nouville but refused evacuation. With bandages covering one eye, de Sobry led this unlikely force into battle. They met the Germans in the woods outside Bastogne. The cooks and clerks fought like veterans. They had heard about nuts. They knew what it meant. No surrender, no retreat. They held the Germans for 3 critical hours until reinforcements arrived. When dawn came, 42 German bodies lay in the snow. The provisional company had lost 18 men, but they had saved Bastogne. On December 26th, the lead elements of the 4th Armoured Division broke through to Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, personally led the attack that opened a corridor to the surrounded town. Captain William Dwight, commanding the first tanks to enter Bastogne, found McAuliffe and asked, "How are you, General?" McAuliffe replied, "Gee, I'm mighty glad to see you." The siege was broken. Bastogne had held. General George Patton arrived soon after, and on December 30th awarded McAuliffe the Distinguished Service Cross. But McAuliffe's modesty was evident. He insisted the real heroes were the paratroopers and soldiers who held the perimeter, the medics who treated wounded without supplies, the artillerymen who made every shell count. His response meant nothing without their willingness to keep fighting. The story of nuts immediately captured American imagination. War correspondents flooded into Bastogne. Newspapers across America ran headlines about the nuts' reply. Radio broadcasters told and retold the story. Editorial writers praised McAuliffe's defiance as quintessentially American. Within days, McAuliffe went from unknown brigadier general to national hero. Mail poured in from across the country. Mothers wrote thanking him for inspiring their sons. School children sent drawings. One company offered to send £10,000 of nuts to Bastogne, but the influence extended far beyond military circles. During the Korean War, when American forces were surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir, Marines would joke about giving the Chinese the Bastogne treatment. During Vietnam, besieged fire bases would reference McAuliffe when refusing enemy surrender demands. The word had become international shorthand for defiance against overwhelming odds. McAuliffe was promoted to Major General on January 3, 1945, and given command of the 103rd Infantry Division. He led them through the final battles in Germany. After the war, he commanded the 7th Army, then United States Army Europe. He retired in 1956 as a full general, but for the rest of his life, wherever he went, he was the nuts general. The town of Bastogne never forgot. The main square was renamed Place General McAuliffe. A monument was erected with the story of nuts inscribed in multiple languages. Every December, the town holds ceremonies commemorating the siege. The Sherman tank that stands in the square bears battle damage from the fighting, a permanent reminder of those desperate days. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who suggested using nuts as the official response, would go on to pioneer the use of helicopters in, quote, combat during Vietnam, commanding the 1st Air Cavalry Division. He always said his greatest contribution to military history was recognizing that McAuliffe's instinctive response was perfect. Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the message, stayed in the Army and eventually commanded the United States Army Infantry School. Private First Class Ernest Premetz returned home and became a marine biologist, but every December 22nd, he remembered standing in the snow, telling German officers they could go to hell. The veterans of Bastogne formed the Association of the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, taking pride in the nickname German propaganda had given them as an insult. They held reunions every year, growing older, fewer, but never forgetting. Staff Sergeant Joseph Rogan of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was checking his men's positions when word spread about McAuliffe's response. His men were exhausted, freezing, almost out of ammunition. He thought they were finished. Then he heard about nuts. It was like someone turned on a light in a dark room, he said later. Private William Sakanicus of the 327th Glider Infantry was wounded, lying in a church being used as an aid station, when a medic told him about the surrender demand and McAuliffe's response. The church was St. Peter's, its stained glass windows blown out, snow drifting through the gaps. Wounded men lay in rows on the stone floor, some moaning, others silent. The smell of blood, gangrene, and human waste filled the air. Despite the pain from shrapnel in his leg, Sakanicus smiled. That's our general, he thought. We're surrounded, bleeding, freezing, but we're telling them to go to hell. Technical Sergeant Donald Burgett of the 506th wrote that when he heard about nuts, the fear didn't go away, but it became manageable. If the commanding general could joke in this situation, then it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Burgett had been in combat since Normandy. He had jumped into Holland. He knew what desperate looked like. This was desperate. But nuts changed the equation. It turned desperation into defiance. Private First Class Vincent Speranza of the 501st Parachute Infantry was manning a machine gun position when word came down about the German demand and McAuliffe's response. It was so cold that Speranza had to chip ice off his machine gun's barrel every few minutes. His hands were so numb he could barely feel the trigger. German tanks were probing their lines, looking for weak spots. Then he heard about nuts. Speranza laughed for the first time in days. Years later, at age 94, he would still get emotional talking about that moment, about how one word from a general he had never met gave him the strength to keep fighting. Corporal Walter Gordon of Easy Company, 506th, had been wounded on December 20th, a bullet through his shoulder. He was in the aid station when news of nuts arrived. Despite his pain, Gordon cheered. He had been with Easy Company since Tocco, through Normandy, through Holland. He knew these men. They would fight to the last round, the last man, as long as someone was leading them. McAuliffe's nuts told them someone was. German military historians studied Bastogne extensively after the war. General Heinz Kokott, who commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, wrote that the nuts response demoralized his men more than any American artillery barrage. It showed an enemy who was not thinking about surrender even when logic dictated they should. It suggested the Americans knew something the Germans did not. The single word created doubt, and doubt in combat is deadly. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month after Bastogne was relieved. The Germans fought stubbornly, but the initiative had shifted. By late January 1945, the Germans were back where they started, having suffered over 100,000 casualties. The Western Front would never recover. 4 months later, Germany surrendered. Anthony McAuliffe died on August 10, 1975, at age 77. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His tombstone bears his name, rank, and dates of service. It does not mention nuts. It does not need to. Vincent Vicari, his loyal aide, lived until December 5, 2011, age 92. To the end, he defended the accuracy of the nuts story against skeptics who thought it must have been something more profane. Military academies worldwide study Bastogne as an example of defense against superior forces. At West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr, and staff colleges around the world, officers analyze the tactical decisions, the positioning of forces, the allocation of scarce resources. But they always include the story of nuts because it demonstrates something that cannot be taught in a classroom: the importance of moral courage, of maintaining cool spirit under extreme stress, of understanding that sometimes victory comes not from superior tactics or equipment, but from simply refusing to quit. Young officers are taught to examine the correlation between morale and combat effectiveness. Studies show that units with high morale can overcome odds of 3-1 or even 5-1, as Bastogne proved. They learn that leadership in crisis is not about managing resources, but about managing fear, doubt, and despair. McAuliffe managed all three with a single word. The story has been told in countless books, documentaries, and films. The 1949 movie Battleground, with Van Johnson and Ricardo Montalban, brought Bastogne to American theaters. The scene where the German demand arrives and word spreads about nuts became one of the most famous moments in war cinema. Band of Brothers, the 2001 HBO series, devoted 2 episodes to Bastogne, showing how McAuliffe's defiance filtered down to the individual foxhole. But perhaps the most powerful testament comes not from Hollywood but from the veterans themselves. At reunions of the 101st Airborne Division Association, old men would gather, their numbers dwindling each year. They would talk about friends long dead, about moments of terror and moments of triumph. And always, inevitably, someone would raise a glass and say nuts, and everyone would laugh, remembering that December day when their general told the Germans to go to hell. First Sergeant Leonard Funk of the 502nd Parachute Infantry, who would win the Medal of Honor in January 1945, said that Bastogne taught him what Americans were capable of when pushed to the limit. We found out we could take anything the Germans could dish out and give it back harder. Nuts was just our way of saying bring it on. Major Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th, who would become famous through Band of Brothers, wrote in his memoirs that McAuliffe's place 2P. The response was worth a division of reinforcements. It gave us something to fight for beyond survival. It gave us pride. We were the guys who said nuts to the Wehrmacht. That meant something. Even German veterans, in post-war interviews, acknowledged the psychological impact. General Major Heinz Kokott, who commanded the 26th Volksgrenadier Division at Bastogne, admitted that the American response baffled and demoralized his troops. We could not understand an enemy who would joke when surrounded. It suggested they knew something we did not. It made us hesitant, uncertain. In war, uncertainty is fatal. The influence extended to other conflicts, other armies. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, when the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem was surrounded, the defenders explicitly referenced Bastogne. During the Korean War, when the 1st Marine Division was surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir, Marine Commander General Oliver Smith said, "Retreat, hell, we're not retreating. We're just advancing in a different direction." The spirit of nuts lived on. In Vietnam, when Fire Support Base Ripcord was surrounded by North Vietnamese forces in 1970, the American commander was asked if he would consider withdrawal. He replied, "McAuliffe didn't withdraw from Bastogne, and we're not withdrawing from Ripcord." They held for 23 days before finally being evacuated. The tradition continued in Iraq and Afghanistan, where surrounded outposts would paint nuts on their walls, a connection across generations to that December day in Belgium. Today, 79 years later, the story endures. Bastogne has become a place of pilgrimage. Veterans return, now in their 90s or represented by children and grandchildren. They walk the perimeter where young men held the line. They stand in the square where McAuliffe's statue looks out over the town he saved. They visit the War Museum where McAuliffe's uniform is displayed, along with the typewriter that produced the famous message. The Bastogne War Museum, opened in 2014 for the 70th anniversary, uses modern technology to recreate the siege. Visitors experience the cold, hear the artillery, feel the desperation. But the climactic moment is always the same, the German surrender demand and McAuliffe's response. Nuts. Visitors from around the world, speaking dozens of languages, all understand that moment. It transcends language, culture, time. It speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the refusal to surrender when surrender seems logical. Belgian citizens have not forgotten either. Every December, they hold ceremonies honoring the American defenders. School children learn about the siege, about McAuliffe, about nuts. They tend the graves at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, where many of the defenders are buried. They ensure that the sacrifice is remembered, the story is told. The tactical lessons of Bastogne are taught at military academies: interior, lines, economy of force, combined arms defense. But the deeper lesson is about human nature. When people believe in their cause, when they trust their leaders, when they refuse to accept defeat, they can achieve the impossible. McAuliffe understood this. His nuts was not bravado. It was recognition that his soldiers would rather die fighting than live surrendering. In that basement in Bastogne, when presented with an ultimatum that logic said he should consider, McAuliffe instead gave the perfect response. Not a sophisticated word, not a diplomatic word, not a military word, just an American word that every American soldier understood and that left every German soldier confused and demoralized. It was instinctive, authentic, perfect. It came from a general who had walked the lines, seen the suffering, measured the courage of his men, and knew they would not quit. The final statistics tell only part of the story. The 101st Airborne Division's casualties from December 19th, 1944 to January 6th, 1945 were 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing. The other units defending Bastogne suffered proportionally, but they held. They denied the Germans the crossroads they desperately needed. They bought time for Patton to arrive, for the weather to clear, for the tide to turn. But beyond the numbers, beyond the tactics, beyond the strategy, Bastogne represents something larger. It represents the moment when ordinary people, pushed beyond endurance, find within themselves extraordinary courage. It represents the power of leadership to transform despair into determination. It represents the truth that wars are won not just with weapons and logistics, but with will and spirit. One word did not win the war, but one word at the right moment helped ensure the war would be won. One word showed that Americans, citizen soldiers far from home, would fight with the same determination as any professional military in history. One word demonstrated that overwhelming force could be met with overwhelming will. One word proved that in warfare, moral factors can overcome material disadvantages. That word was nuts. Simple, clear, defiant, perfect. It came from the gut of a general who knew his men, knew their capabilities, knew they would rather die than surrender. It expressed in 4 letters what volumes of military doctrine try to explain about fighting spirit, unit cohesion, and combat leadership. It reminded us that sometimes, in the darkest moments, when logic says surrender and survival instinct says quit, the human spirit can say something else entirely. It can say nuts. The Germans demanded surrender. McAuliffe said nuts. The Americans held. The Germans failed. The war was won. History was made. All because one general, at one moment, found exactly the right word to express American defiance. Not through careful deliberation, not through strategic calculation, but through simple human instinct that recognized surrender was not an option. In 4 letters, he captured the essence of the American warrior spirit. In one word, he defined defiance for all time: nuts. It echoes still across the decades, a reminder that freedom is defended not just with weapons but with will, not just with strategy but with spirit, not just with logic but with the simple refusal to give up when giving up seems the only rational choice. That is the true lesson of Bastogne. That is why we remember. That is why, 79 years later, in a world that has forgotten so much, we still remember a general who said nuts to an enemy that demanded surrender. Because in that word, in that moment, in that choice, we see the best of what we can be when faced with the worst of what we must endure.